Hi all, welcome back to Tallulah Talks, and today it's Wednesday, which means it is Serial Killer Wednesday. Today I hadn't actually heard of this killer. He was born in the Soviet Union, and his name is Andre Chikatilo, and he was known as a rapist, a cannibal, a paedophile, a murderer, and a necrophiliac. He is one of the worst. I don't think I've ever heard of a murderer that's worse than this. So I do have my book of stories. As you know, I do look at my notes quite a bit. It's just because my memory is crap. And so I'm going to be reading from what I call my book of stories. So let's begin. Okay. So, as I've just said, he was known as a prolific cannibal, a paedophile and a killer who murdered at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990. And there are reasons for why he wasn't caught for such a long time, and we're going to get into that. So he was born October 16th, 1936, and at that point, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and he was born in Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union, and this was during Stalin's regime. Due to agriculture the way it was at the time, people found it very difficult to feed themselves and to grow their food, and so this could be just rumours, but it was said that a lot of families who couldn't afford to feed themselves or couldn't grow crops, they actually took part in cannibalism. I believe Andre was actually told by his mum that he had an older brother called Stefan, and that the neighbours had taken Stefan and had killed him and eaten him. But there's no record of this Stefan being born, so we're not actually sure if this is true or if she said this just to scare him. His parents were farm labourers, and they all shared a single room, which meant his parents and him all shared a bed. And unfortunately, Chikatilo, he actually found out that he had some sort of brain damage, and this in turn had an effect on his bladder, and he would often urinate himself, and it was just one of those things that he couldn't help. But his mother, she punished him quite severely for doing this, especially he was, quite an avid bedwetter. He obviously couldn't help it. It was all to do with his brain damage and the function of the bladder. Later, Andre's little sister was born. Andre's father was drafted into the Red Army and left the rest of the family in the crossfire of the German Blitz. Like I said, that same year, Andre's mother gave birth to a little girl, but going by the maths and that the father was away at the time, they figured it could not have been his child, so she committed adultery. When the war ended, Andre's father was placed in a Russian camp, and this was because he had surrendered in combat. And so from that point, Andre had nothing to do with his father, and the mother had nothing to do with him, because they would have been known as a coward's family. He was socially awkward and had a lot of self-hatred for himself in his teenage years, and when they found out about the brain damage, it also caused him to have erectile dysfunction. He had problems getting erections with his genitalia, or impotence, as it's also known. And this actually ruined his first attempt at a relationship at the age of 23. He was described as a pretty good student. However, he did fail his entrance exams into the Moscow State University. He ended up joining the military, and after he had finished his sentence in the military, he then became a telephone engineer in 1960. In 1963, he married a woman whom his sister introduced him to, and although they didn't have an intimate relationship a lot of the time because of his impotence. They actually did manage to have a son and a daughter. And in 1971, he actually gained a degree in Russian literature. So he's quite a smart man. He then also gained a teaching position at the local school. However, he was quite often accused of molestation. He managed to hold on to this job for nearly 10 years. But in 1978, he accepted a new position in Shakti, not sure where that is, and moved there. So while living there and waiting for the arrival of his family, who was still wherever he had lived before, he had began having pedophilic fantasies. So he would spy on kids from a small hut, and he would fantasize about, sexually assaulting these children. And on December 21st, he actually committed his first known murder, and this was in 1978. He kidnapped a 9-year-old little girl called Yelena Zapatrova and stabbed her to death in the woods. And once he had done this, he ejaculated. He did plan to rape her, but because of his impotence, that couldn't happen, and so he eventually just killed her and ejaculated afterwards. Over the next 12 years, Andre committed over 50 murders, but this is just what we know of. But in the Soviet Union at the time, because the government controlled all media and they didn't want to scare people, crimes like murder and rape were very much suppressed. And so when these children went missing or when they turned up dead, the media would not report on this, that they just weren't allowed. The murders weren't actually published until 1984. And Andre was suspected of killing Yelena, but someone else actually confessed. I'm not sure why that someone confessed. It seems a little bit weird, but he maybe just wanted to gain a little bit of notoriety. I don't know why, but yeah. September 1984, he was arrested for soliciting a prostitute. And he was searched at this time, and on his person he had a knife, a rope, and the petroleum jelly. And he had actually been seen with a number of young people who had gone missing, and so they actually kept him. But however, a lot of the victims had been ejaculated on, but his blood didn't match the semen sample that was found on the bodies. Some claim that this is a clerical error, but some also claim that his blood type wouldn't be determined due to non-secretion and ejaculation. Weeks after his arrest, he was expelled from his communism party because he had actually been stealing from his job for the last 3 months. November 1990, he was then questioned about being in the same area as, again, one of his victims, Svetlana Kodistik. He was formally arrested, and it was at that time he admitted to 52 murders, but he was only found guilty of 36. And I think this is because a lot of the bodies weren't found. April 14th, 1992, the trial began, and his behaviour was described as really bizarre. He would pull down his pants, he would expose himself, he would shout that he wasn't gay. Very weird thing to shout. And this was a weird one. He claimed to be pregnant and lactating, and in court he alternated between boredom and anger. So he had very erratic behaviours and emotions throughout this time. October 14th, 1992, he was found guilty, and on February 14th, 1994, he was executed via gunshot. So going on to his MO, he mainly targeted children and teens of any gender, didn't matter if they were female or male, and they were like young children to like women in their 30s. So yeah, he would approach these people in a public space, like at a bus station, and depending on who it was, he would promise them money or drugs or alcohol. And when it was the kids that he was trying to lure in, he would promise them toys and candy, which worked. He would kill by stabbing, using rope to secure them, tie them up, and he did this to gain a sexual release. This was like the only way that he could sexually please himself. He mutilated some of his victims by gouging out their eyes. He basically believed that if he had left the eyes, they would have this picture of the last moment that they had seen, which would be him killing them, so he took them. But when he was told this wasn't true, like for later victims, he didn't gouge their eyes out. He would chew off their noses, cut out their tongues, and their genitals. In one scenario event that had happened, he bit the nipple off of a woman and swallowed it. When torturing his male victims, he fantasized about them being his prisoners and that he was some sort of hero and he was doing this to rescue them. So looking into the psychology that could explain why he did these things, a psychiatrist called Alexander, I'm not going to try and say that last name, I can't pronounce it, stated that Andre was a sexual deviant and suffered from some type of sexual inadequacy, and as we looked at earlier, this could be to do with the brain damage in which he was impotent. And because of this, he would brutalize and torture his victims because he couldn't get an erection. It was believed that Andre was also borderline due to his unstable relationships, his erratic behaviours, his actions, his emotions. And I'm not saying everyone with borderline would do this. Of course not. This is just an explanation into why he might have committed the murders that he did. I'm just going to go through some of his known victims. I'm not going through all of them because that would take forever, but here are some of his victims. So in 1954, there was an unnamed girl of 11 who he assaulted and wrestled to the ground. Don't think he killed her. I think he assaulted her. In 1964, another unnamed girl who was 16, he groped her and he sexually assaulted her. December 22nd, 1978 was Yelena Zakharova, who was 9, who he intended to rape, but because he couldn't get an erection, he just stabbed instead and ejaculated. September 3rd, 1981 was Larissa Kachenko, who was 17. She was strangled, disemboweled, and had her genitals removed. 1982, June 12th, was Lybov Biryuk, who was 12, stabbed 22 times, and it said necrophiliac abuse, so he did sexually abuse the body and the eyes were removed. July 25th, Lyubov Volodbovya, who was 14. August 13th was Oleg, who was 9, who had genitals removed, but unfortunately he was never found. August 16th was Olga Kuprina, who was 16, and he had actually opened up her chest cavity and removed her heart after death had taken place. So these were just some of his victims, and what he did to them was beyond disgusting. There's no justifying this. However, psychologically speaking, he was a very disturbed individual, taking into account his brain damage, in which, he suffered from poor bladder control. He couldn't get erections. He was impotent. I think all of that definitely plays a factor. And that is the story of Andre Chikatilo. If this is something you enjoy, hearing about true crime, murder, the psychology behind this, definitely hit that subscribe button. I am here every Wednesday to talk about serial killers, and every Saturday to talk about hauntings. Definitely hit that subscribe button. Bye.